to you all. So this is the webinar we're really looking at the opportunity on how to embrace the mandatory climate disclosure reporting that's coming down the line shortly. My name is 𝐘𝐨𝐮𝐫, I'm Director at WordStruck, and I'm really delighted to be with my two colleagues today, Eleanor Ackers from Innovative Energy Consultants, calling in from the UK, and Janine Barron, also calling in from the UK, from London. So just a couple of housekeeping things. We actually are happy for you to have audio on, as long as you don't have a dog barking behind you. And we would love to answer your questions in this 1 hour that we have together. So please do put questions in the chat, and please make this a safe space for everybody. What's great about seeing where you're calling in from is really to get a sense of this vast land that we now call Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge the country that I'm on, which is the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation in Sydney. And many of you are calling in from other parts of the land. And for me, as a storyteller, I always like to honour the First Nations heritage of storytelling, and we're stepping into deep, well-worn footprints when we tell stories on this land. So today is an introduction from the three of us to give you a really great international perspective of what the mandatory climate reporting is going to mean in Australia. We see it as a huge opportunity, and we also see that there's real opportunity for companies to stand out from the crowd and really be a thought leader in this space. So thank you for taking up your time today. We would love to ask you a question. What is the reason, the one reason why you're here today? If you could put that in the chat, that'd be great. And we will endeavour to answer your questions throughout the process of our time together. So if there's anything, any burning issue or the one real reason that's brought you here today. And if there's nothing else housekeeping-wise or introduction-wise, I'm going to hand over to Eleanor to kick us off.
Thank you, Claire. So just bear with while I share my screen. I'm going to give a quick overview of the agenda. So we've had a wonderful welcome and acknowledgement of country. I'm now going to dive into why we're here today before taking a look at the standards themselves and the opportunities that these create for Australian business. I'll then hand over to Janine, who's going to really focus on the strategic opportunities created by the legislation. She'll then pass the baton on to Claire, who will talk to you about how this legislation can be used to drive stories to inspire your audiences. We'll then give you an overview of the next steps before opening the floor for Q&A and wrapping up at 5 o'clock promptly, because I'm sure you've all got places to be this evening. So why we're here, climate-related financial disclosures. This is the latest piece of sustainability legislation looming in Australia. So one thing to note is the Australian legislation have made the very conscious decision to use the phrase climate-related rather than sustainability. And I think this is just to really focus it on environmental sustainability. So I will use the two terms interchangeably, and I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that to prevent confusion down the line. So we got here because in 2007, Australia started with the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act. So this was the first piece of Australian legislation that required companies to report on their emissions. It only really applied to really large emitters like coal mines, power stations, but it was a start. And then in 2015, Australia joined 195 other countries in signing the Paris Agreement. This is a really groundbreaking piece of international legislation that has kind of set out humanity's goal of reducing emissions to the point where global warming will be below 2 degrees centigrade. So you've probably heard that number battered around before. You may have even seen in the news that we're actually approaching 1.5 degrees of global warming. So we do need to act now. Australia followed this with the Climate Change Act of 2022, which is when Australia followed in the footsteps of countries like the UK and Sweden by setting out a legally binding net zero by 2050 target. That means that Australia needs to reduce its emissions to net zero by 2050. And so to do this, Australia is now requiring companies to report on their emissions, because if emissions aren't measured, we can't reduce them. And so that's what this latest piece of legislation is all about, really. So it's currently in draft. It's expected to be finalised later this year, maybe even as soon as next month. And the legislation is really referring to two standards that are being developed by the Australian Accounting Standards Board, the AASB. There's a lot of acronyms in this, so we will send some of this material around afterwards for your reference. But the legislation requires all large AS-listed companies and large private companies to report to the two standards, the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards 1 and the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards 2. And these are modelled on the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, International Financial Reporting Standards 1 and 2. And this creates our first opportunity. Countries like New Zealand have already taken up ISSB. The EU's legislation is very closely modelled on this. So by being modelled on this international legislation, it's setting up Australian companies to compete on a global stage. Because if you've got all of this data, you've got all of this reporting done for the Australian sustainability reporting standards, it doesn't take a lot of effort to tweak that data to fit in with international reporting standards, which make it easier to trade with countries like New Zealand and the EU. And so these are expected to come into play later this year, and the largest Australian companies will have to begin reporting on them in early 2025. So divided into two standards, and they're really requiring Australian businesses to report on climate-related risks and opportunities. So an example of a climate-related risk would be if you're a dairy farmer, you might have pasture land in an area that is at risk of drought, which means that you'll no longer be able to graze cattle on that land. So that's a risk. But because Australia is aware of climate change and there's an increased demand for renewable energy, there might be a demand to use that land as a solar farm and generate revenue from selling electricity. So that's a climate-related opportunity. The legislation also requires you to report on the difference between a physical risk and a transitional risk or opportunity. So a physical risk or opportunity is something like, I will no longer be able to graze my cattle on this piece of land because it's physically at risk of drought. And a transitional risk or opportunity is something like, because Australia is transitioning to a net zero country, there's an opportunity for me to sell green power. So physical is what's actually happening with the climate, and transitional is the risk or opportunity created due to Australia's move towards becoming net zero. So diving into the data reporting and education that this legislation and these standards require. The legislation is built around 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, targets, and metrics. So when we're talking about climate-related governance, what we're really talking about is spelling out what are those transitional risks and opportunities and physical risks and opportunities that your company has identified, disclosing those as part of your annual financial report, in the same way that today you talk about the prospects of a business, looking at its financial opportunities and risks, or its market opportunities and risks. You're now required to also report on those transitional and physical climate-related opportunities and risks. And you're also required to report on who is responsible for what. So what are the board's responsibilities? What are senior management's responsibilities related to these risks and opportunities? Risk management is how well these risks and opportunities are being managed, what processes, what policies are in place, how these are integrated into overall risk management. And also, interestingly, you're now required to report on scenario analyses. So this is, if global warming increases by this much, this is the impact it will have on my business. And one of the things that you're required to report on is the scenario of 1.5 degrees centigrade of global warming. So that's, in order to achieve 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, my business will need to reduce its emissions to X, and it will do this by measure Y. So really spelling it out. And that obviously has huge impacts on your strategy, on your prospects, your business model, your supply chain. And so you're also required to report on that. You really need to look at your supply chain very closely, because if your supply chain is really at risk from climate change, then your business is at risk. And this legislation is requiring you to recognize that and report on it. And then targets and metrics. This is when are you going to be net zero by? What are your emissions reductions going to be in that first 10 years? And if you have an internal carbon price, an internal value of what carbon is, you're also required to disclose that. So what opportunities does this create? I've just been through all of the obligations, but how do you turn that into an opportunity? So I want to use Atlassian as a case study to illustrate this. So Atlassian it's probably my favorite software company. Actually, I really love Confluence, really easy to use, very famous Australian company. And they've been doing sustainability reporting for 5 years now. It's not mandatory for them. It's something they've chosen to do to strengthen their business. So I've just put a few extracts from what they've done on top of that, which is they've released an open source guide as to how they've done their sustainability reporting. Really recommend looking at it. It's called Don't #% the planet. And in that, they show how they've calculated their carbon footprint, their methodology, and they've shared this vision, which is really informed by their sustainability strategy. But what I think is really key is they're using that to promote a message of we're building a 100-year company together. Atlassian is a relatively new company, but they've used their commitment to sustainability to demonstrate that they're in it for the long run, to drive investor confidence, which, as you can see from the extract of their share price, they've been pretty successful at. So they've turned what could be seen as, oh, it's a lot of work, I've got to do this, into this is how we're showing that we're a good investment, that we're going to be here, that we are a forward-thinking company. And I think that this legislation provides a framework for all Australian businesses to do the same. So taking a deep dive into the opportunities created by the governance, it's an opportunity to have internal alignment between your board and your senior management team. It's a new lens to review your business model, and it's an opportunity to clarify your purpose. But to do this, you need to ensure that all of your decision makers have a base level of education and that there is a time and structure set aside to make these decisions. So one of the things that my company does is we do work with senior leaders to run these sustainability strategy days. And as part of that, we provide people with information packs, get everyone on the same page. And it is amazing the conversations that happen because you don't know what you don't know. And so getting the finance people in the room with the operations people, with the strategy people, that's where the magic happens. Risk management. As with all risk management, it's an opportunity to be proactive rather than reactive, to be forward thinking. It's also a great chance to talk to your supply chain. Again and again, I hear collaboration, collaboration, collaboration as the theme of sustainability. That's why Janine, myself, and Claire are here today. This is a really complicated issue. None of us are going to solve climate change alone. And so it's a great opportunity to talk to your supply chain about what you're going to do together and strengthen those relationships. It's also an opportunity to stay up to date with the latest technology and ensure compliance with the law so you can keep operating and doing all the great things that your business does. But to make the most of these opportunities, you need a robust internal risk management plan, a clear organizational structure, and also compliance expertise. It's no good collecting all the data if you then submit it in the wrong portal on the Australian Government Board. You need to know how you're going to collect this data and how you're going to present it in order to be compliant. Metrics and targets. These can be a bit of a double-edged sword. Having really strong metrics and targets means that you need to have really good data collection. And so that's a really rich opportunity to truly understand your business and to drive powerful investor communications and your marketing. But there is a bit of a risk. You may have seen the news recently that Australia had to row back on their, not Australia, Scotland had to row back on their flagship climate change policy. So Scotland set a net zero target of 2030, which is super ambitious compared to the rest of the UK, which is 2050. But they hadn't done the work to really understand how they were going to achieve that. And so embarrassingly, a few months ago, they had to row back on it, and it's predicted to really impact the ruling party, the Scottish National Party's chances at the next election. And the same is true of a company. If you come out with really ambitious net zero targets and have to row back on them, it reduces confidence in your leadership, in your products, and your strategy. And so to have really strong, powerful, and appropriate metrics and targets, you need to understand what it is you're measuring. You need clear communication channels within the business to ensure that you're not missing anything. And you need to understand your audience's priorities. So that's why one of the things we do is materiality assessments. That's where we talk to internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, because if your supply chain is actually really worried about water usage and drought, there needs to be focus in your business on that to take advantage of those opportunities. Whereas if they really want to know that you're going to be net zero by 2038, you need to have a plan of how your business will achieve that. And then finally, strategy. Having net zero by 2050 gives us a 26-year horizon. I don't know where the end's gone, sorry about that. So I'm going to hand over to Janine now, who's going to talk to you about how you can really use this legislation to create a strategic opportunity for your business.
I would say it's an exciting time. As I said in my recent article that has brought some of you here today, it's not that we're behind or the last, it's actually we get to take the advantage of all the learning that has brought other companies to here today. So I'm going to take about 10 minutes to just explore this idea of strategy as a pathway. And I think probably the first place to start is looking at how sustainability has been treated until now. So this is a typical look at a company. So if you just think about your own company, where is sustainability sitting as an outside? Is it a possible have? Is it a nice have? There's been no legislation or anything other than your own values to compel you to have sustainability in your business. And it's usually that one lone person who's feeling very under-resourced. They're often out there self-educating. Companies aren't even funding their education. And I can see Work for Climate's here today, where people are approaching these organizations and getting self-educated. I think the big mistake that some companies might take in this time is to do the same with the compliance, to keep it as an external factor. And I think if you just take a moment to look at this, because what's going to happen if you take this approach is the accountancy firm or whoever you go to, if you're outsourcing this, they're going to be pushing back to you on your strategy. And you do not want to feel the pressure and pushback of an external agency that it gets very, very expensive telling you what you must change to meet legal requirements. You want to be the forward-thinking company that looks a little bit more like this. Bringing your green people in with your blues and your yellows. You want to embed sustainability across all operations. And this is the absolute huge opportunity at this time. And it's the fundamental strategy shift that everyone needs to be considering. And you can see there from the CommBank recent report on manufacturing that at least a third of manufacturing businesses are already seeing this opportunity. So that's the fundamental shift. Now, when I usually sit with leaders to do strategy work, we obviously have a series of much more micro questions than this. But today, I think this is the important place to start, to ask the big, broad brushstroke questions. And when I'm doing leadership coaching, actually, this is where we end up spending a lot of time because they're kind of the big value-based questions and they're the business case questions. So let's have a brief look at what some benefits we're seeing abroad are. First of all, we're seeing leaders coming into the conversations and just getting brave and vulnerable about what they don't know. Personally, along with Claire and Eleanor, I've been deep in sustainability for decades. So this is second nature to me, but I still have a lot to learn. So when I sit down with a leader, I just try to create a trusting, safe space to say, I know you don't know a lot and it's okay. And then we look at what kind of experts in education is required to get them up to speed. And that's where we start to see the excitement kick in, because then they use their skills as a leader to start to see the business case matching the value chain. But getting to that heart of the why, unless we do that in a sort of a coaching conversation first, it's very difficult to run a strategy day, because otherwise it's just seen as a very practical and it feels more like a pressure cooker rather than an opportunity. So I think the first lead is to just educate yourself, as Eleanor said, understand the timeline we're on, but also to have the conversations about, gosh, another leadership challenge. How do we deal with this sustainability as well as AI and cybersecurity and all the other threats that leadership are challenged by? And how can this actually help us grow our company, which is what all leaders want to know at the end of the day. There's things we have to know. So as well as the context, which Eleanor's done a great job of getting us to, there's more to learn. And it's finding the trigger points in your own unique company that can be catalyzed around this. We're seeing in the UK in particular, this incredible new culture around sort of like a well-being culture at work, where people are drawn together by this kind of commitment and values are bringing people together. People are within the team are having a more positive view of their company, and that's being reflected in long-term strategic visions across all portfolios. So this is actually happening, and it's probably was an accidental benefit as people have stepped on the road to compliance, but it was the ones that really looked at their why first. So this marrying of people and planet and purpose with profit is a whole new era that we're in business. So you can be the person doing compliance outside of the circle, or you can bring it into the circle. And they're the kind of people we certainly want to be talking to. And then we can get to the place where you would normally traditionally begin, which is a road mapping day, a kind of a strategy day. But there's so many conversations and education to be had before that. So that's probably our best advice today. Because when you get that right and it's done in the right order, it will naturally trickle down and weave throughout your company in a really catalytic and productive way. The business opportunities, as well as new markets, customer segments, product development, attracting investors, is the standard efficiency improvements you're always looking for in a company. There will be grants available for these kind of things sometimes, and it's going to attract new investors. And so it's going to become best business case, a good strategy that includes sustainability. We're seeing two really interesting trends in Europe and UK and US, which is this. There's new businesses arriving in your supply chain, and one of them is branding and communications, and the other one is recruitment. Now, anyone who has a traditional advertising agency right now, the challenge they have is that they don't understand the language. They don't know the lingo, and they're not getting across the facts and the timelines like you are here today. That is resulting in two really big challenges for a business. Green hushing is when you don't talk about what you're doing, and that's because traditional comms agencies, they don't know the language, so they just kind of put it to the side and don't talk about it. This is a distinct disadvantage for a company that has a comms agency that doesn't understand what they're doing. So we need to potentially educate them as well. And then there's greenwashing. A traditional agency is so busy boasting about what you might do that they're now breaching the legal requirements of what you can say is true and factually backed up. So you want to avoid greenwashing and green hushing. So we're seeing these branding and comm agencies specializing. A lot of them are B Corps, but they're all carbon literate and they're getting up to speed with how to communicate about your new strategy. So we're linked with a lot of these experts. It's one of the services we offer, is that we can get you in touch with good people. And then, of course, recruitments, just very briefly. We're seeing these specialist recruitment agencies because you want good talent. And talent are leaving companies who aren't committing to an environmental pathway. And so if you want to keep talent or recruit talent, especially the new generation coming through, there's these new recruitment agencies that are matching on a values basis. So it's really fascinating to see the new businesses that are arriving to support you in a supply chain. And so before we have that strategy day, it's thinking about who you want on your team. And I think the best people you're looking for in your team, I call them educators and igniters. And they're the people who are going to naturally, of their own will and excitement, once you empower them, engage the rest of the team. It has to start with senior leadership, but it will trickle down. It comes back to the talent that we're just talking about. There's probably people in your teams now that may not feel they have permission to walk this pathway of sustainability, but the moment you open the door, they will come alive and bring forth their skills to deliver in a way that's really unique. You will need some expert consultants like ourselves, but eventually you want to be educating your own team and drawing from within that. And it's these culture change makers that you're looking for. And to do that, it starts in your team internally before you communicate it externally. And so asking yourself, who is telling your story? Is our agency fit for purpose? So there's a whole lot of people in your existing supply chain that currently, as part of a strategy, we need to say, are they up to speed? Do we need to educate them, or do we need to get someone else? So I'm going to leave you with these kind of big questions to consider. And the invitation today is to go back to your own team and ask these questions. Particularly that last one is like, when are we willing to start this conversation? Because it just on a really human level, and we're hearing this, we've heard the word humanity already today. It's a beautiful thing happening in business where we're actually just getting real and using the language of love and beauty, and because climate change is real and we're embracing it on a personal level, but it's now companies need to do that and they're legally complied to. So just in quick summary, it's embedding sustainability as core to your strategy. It's knowing that climate change is a driver for all your customers out there, and it's time for the company to do it. One of the surprising effects is it just feels good. We're seeing this amazing trend in this kind of meaningful work movement, and people are just wanting to go to work again, and they're wanting to put in extra effort because they understand why. They really engage more when they know they're making a good impact, particularly an environmental one. So I mentioned earlier that there were 5 questions, and I didn't tell you what the 5th question was because I think this is often a little bit confronting to bring up front. But this is where in our leadership conversations I find people get to. They want to have a positive legacy and they're just not sure how to do it. They're just not sure what they need to know. But those who are willing to get into a conversation around that, they're the people I really want to connect with, and they're the ones that are making the real difference. So I do invite you to reach out at the end to have a conversation if you're inspired today. But how do you create that positive legacy? Well, I'm going to hand you over to our strategic storytelling expert, 𝐘𝐨𝐿 to learn about that.
There's questions coming through on the chat, and so we are compiling them and we will come to them shortly. So as Janine was saying, often that idea of the legacy is something that isn't always talked about, but can actually be really powerful. And we had this experience recently with one of our clients. So through my company, WordStruck, we help businesses communicate better through storytelling. And increasingly, we're doing that through storytelling around climate, regenerative storytelling, bringing to life the idea of regeneration as well as sustainability. And in early 2023, this company, an Australian and New Zealand company called 𝐴LSCO Uniforms, engaged us to help them create an end-to-end strategic story for their team. And often we find when these sorts of experiences, there's often a trigger as to why a company wants to get ahead and why they're keen to really push the sustainability agenda. And 𝐴LSCO Uniforms are one of Australia's leading providers of linen and uniforms. They have about 50,000 customers across the country, and they have big industrial laundries which consume a lot of power and a lot of water. And about 2 years before they engaged us, they had a new CEO, Mark Roberts, come and take over the company. Mark had come from New Zealand, and in New Zealand, sustainability was very much just what you did, and it is what you do, present tense. And Mark found that when he came to Australia, he wasn't getting that same traction. And so he saw that storytelling could be a really good way to engage his leadership team and the broader company. And often during a process of sitting down with leaders, you really understand what's driving people and what's making them tick. And you're always looking for turning points because stories are all about turning points. So we were sitting in the first workshop and we asked them, what is the legacy you want as a company? What do you want to be remembered for? And bang, that was the moment when they sort of really started to engage, and you felt there was that emotional connection. And it turned out that Mark, in his personal life, had just become a grandfather. So he was already thinking about this. He was already thinking about his future grandchildren. And this idea really resonated. So when we're thinking about how to use story, we're always trying to think about what is this story that's really going to make one company stand out from the crowd. And in the animation and graphic that we created for 𝐴LSCO Uniforms, we came up with this image at the end that doing better by the planet will be better for business and ultimately create a better legacy. The team at 𝐴LSCO Uniforms were really happy with our work. For us, this quote from Mark, the CEO, the thing I most appreciate about it is the fact that he talks about how storytelling can start to change behavior. And what we're talking about with storytelling is not just storytelling as information, as comms, but as a way to nudge people to shift their behavior so we can all move towards these goals faster. So stories are about a moment in time, and right now this is a really big moment in time with the new mandatory climate disclosure regulations coming in. This quote, "This is a once in a generational change," is from the ASIC chair, Joe Longo. He recently said it at an international sustainability forum in Melbourne. And he went on to say that it's not enough for companies to just see this as something coming. It's important that companies act now. He said a compliant company is a successful company. So there's this real driving momentum, and we want to harness this momentum. It's a big moment in time. It's a powerful time to create a compelling story for your team. So at WordStruck, we actually focus on the internal storytelling piece. So that's how leaders communicate, how they get buy-in. And it resonates with what Janine was saying about the comms agencies who are also thinking about external storytelling. There are many definitions of story. This is the one we particularly like because it's short and easy to remember. Stories of data with soul. And what we're talking about with the 4 pillars that Eleanor described coming into this new period of regulatory reporting, we're going to have to find the data. We're going to report on the data, but we don't want that data to sit in silos. We want to use that data, harness it, wrap it with emotion, and that's what creates a powerful story. And that's because, to quote Maya Angelou, the civil rights activist and poet, people don't always remember what you say, but they do remember how you make them feel. So let's look at what stories can do for you, how they can help. So they're really good at explaining the why. Quite often in business, we talk a lot about the what and the how, we forget about the why. Stories can help you create that bigger context. They can then create the buy-in that you want, create that influence, bring the right people into the room, and then communicate in a way that really pulls people towards you. We often talk about stories being a pull form of communication. Over time, because this regulatory reporting is annual, we want to use story to help build that organizational knowledge, to deeply understand how sustainability can change the heart of your business. And then lastly, once you've got a new strategy, once you've really started to integrate sustainability, stories can be a way to embed that strategic and leadership direction. So a couple of trends that I thought would be helpful for you all to know as you're thinking about how you're going to take this back to your organizations. One of the most comprehensive reports on climate change was done this year, 60,000 people, 23 countries, and they were asked what did they really want. 77% of those interviewed said they want immediate government action on climate change. But the kicker is that why do they want this? The frame that they really responded to was the fact that it's all about caring for future generations. That's really the theme in storytelling and communications that we're seeing coming through. And of course, that also resonated with our client, Alsco Uniforms. The next theme that is particularly coming through from the UK around climate communications is all about finding your persuadables. So there's been a huge amount of work done on how to really get people to act. And it's the persuadable majority that you're really looking to connect with. So that's around 65 to 70% of people in the middle of a society or an organization. So you'll definitely have the really passionate sustainability managers on one end of the spectrum. You'll also have the people on the other who have enough in their day job, they can't go there. So think about how you can use story and messaging to really target this bigger group. And from a business perspective, your persuadables are those people who want to do the right thing, but they don't know how. And your job in your organization is to help them know how to do the right thing. So this really has come to life for me through some work we've been doing with Selfridges in the UK. We've been working with Selfridges for about 4 years now. They're a big luxury department store, and we've helped the CEO and the leadership team really create a strong narrative. And Selfridges have a really interesting journey on sustainability. They started back in 2011. They were very activist in their approach. By 2020, they had really honed what they were doing, and they launched Project Earth. And they went big and bold. They actually emblazoned, let's change the way we shop, across their flagship store in Oxford Street in London. And they put out this big Project Earth report 2 years before the mandatory ESG reporting that came in the UK. So they're a good example of a company that got ahead, saw that they needed to be a brand leader in this space, and then made a big splash about it. What's been interesting is seeing how they've evolved their communication and story and their approach to sustainability since then. They realized that they couldn't be everything to everyone. So they really looked at what their persuadables wanted, their core part of their customers who want to do the right thing but don't know how. And now they've really focused in on their offering called Selfridges, which they've now rolled out across their 4 stores in the UK. And this is very much answering that idea from their customers, that customers want to do the right thing, they want to be sustainable, but it's up to the company to show them how to do that. And Selfridges has really found a great niche, and they're really focusing on circularity and building that into their strategy throughout the whole supply chain internally. So just a few thoughts to think about what story can do for you as I wrap up my section. So stories are meaning makers. That's why we use story. It helps us make sense of a very complex world. And they do the same with data. And when they give meaning to your data, you can use that for your for business case and for presentation. Sometimes a lot of this climate regulations can feel very distant. Stories can help bring it closer. They can make climate feel more personal. And given that this is a long road, we're going to be on it for a while, they're very good at acknowledging progress. They provide good morale boosters. But a few watch outs. Really think about your audience, think about your language, and align those two. I talked about how stories are a way of creating behavioral change. But to do that, you need to think about the levers you're pulling, and that's something we can definitely help you with. It's quite nuanced work, actually, figuring what those levers are for change. And lastly, to build on what Janine said, and Eleanor said, you've got to be transparent about what you are doing, what you aren't doing, and what you're going to do. So if you're not there yet with all of your mandatory reporting, you can use an interim story to help you. Now, even though storytelling is super important, content is important, it's also the messenger. So all of you who've come on this call today, you've taken this time, you are all the messengers. So think about how you're going to take this story around these new regulatory requirements, how you're going to take them back to your organization. So I'll stop sharing there. And I know we've got some juicy questions that have come through. So Janine, as you get together with your last slides, maybe if there's 1 or 2 questions, Eleanor, we can look at.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and I'm loving the questions coming through. I just wanted to wrap up the formal part of this so you've just sort of know what's going to happen next. And that is to just summarize everything we've done today in these 3 beautiful lines. The data, it's going to be really easy that you just make your focus the data, but it's connected to your story and it does tell a story. And that's what will engage your leadership and inform your strategy. So I think that's why we're collaborating today. We see the connection with our different expertise, and we invite you to take a look that way. We are going to have another event on the 26th of June, so you can save the date in your diaries now, and all the details will be coming in the coming days about that. Just remember what you know, just a little summary of the things you might want to remember today, and to think about you as a next action. I really invite everyone here to share that you were here with your colleagues, and what was the thing you are remembering the most. Tell them why you came. Tell them how this might impact your company. Perhaps invite them to have a conversation, and just ask yourself to stay connected to us or whoever you need to stay accountable. It's only by those little reminders that we can be accountable. You're welcome to take a screenshot if you'd like to contact any of us sooner than later, but we will be sending out our contacts for you on the follow-up email. We know a lot of you are watching the recording, and we really appreciate that you have registered, and we know you're taking the time. So that's us. That's been the collaboration today, and now we'd like to take some time to get to your questions. Thank you.